Hi there, and welcome back to Dreamoria. Tonight, I'm going to tell you the entire story of Slavic mythology, from the gods in the sky to the spirits in the forests and rivers. If you enjoy falling asleep to these quiet stories, please like and subscribe. It is the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps more sleepy listeners find us. If you feel like sharing, you can always tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Thank you for being here, and for choosing to spend this part of the night in our little corner of the world. Now, let us begin. In the beginning, there was no forest to whisper, no mountain to cast a shadow, no village fire, no river curling through the dark. There was only water and sky. The water had no shore and no bottom, a heavy black ocean that went on forever. Above it, the sky was an empty vault without a single star to break its smooth, dark face. There was no up or down yet, only the slow heave of the primordial sea, and a silence so complete that even the idea of sound had not been born. This was the first state of the world in the stories of the Slavs, not nothing at all, but a great, endless something, a cold and unshaped mass waiting for a will strong enough to give it form. From that stillness something stirred. It was not a flash or a roar. It began as a breath in the darkness, a thought that had no words yet but wanted very badly to be spoken. The storytellers say that above the water, in that lightless sky, a presence awoke and became aware of itself. This was Rod, the first god, the ancestor of gods and men, the one who would split the world into what is, what will be, and what has been. He did not rise from anyone else. He was not born from a mother or a father. He simply became, like a word that appears in the mind before it is spoken aloud. Rod looked down upon the black water and felt a vast loneliness. He knew, without knowing how he knew, that this was not how things were meant to remain. A god that is awake cannot live inside formlessness for long. So he did what all gods do in the old tales. He created. First, he spoke his own name. In many traditions, that is where power begins. When he said Rod, the word rolled over the water and the surface trembled. A ring of tiny ripples spread outward in all directions, and for the first time there was movement that did not come from the mindless swell of the sea. The sound of that single name reached into the deep and woke another presence that had been sleeping there in the cold gloom, small and hungry and clever. It rose toward the surface, like a bubble pushing through darkness, and when it broke through the skin of the water, it took a shape that Rod could see. Some call it the Dark One, others call it the Serpent, still others simply call it the Trickster. The stories never fully agree on his true name, and perhaps that is fitting for a being who slips so easily between forms. Rod watched as this second spirit pulled itself out of the water and shaped itself into something almost like a man, though its eyes were too bright and its smile a little too wide. It clung to the side of a small boat that had not existed a heartbeat earlier, a narrow craft of pale wood that now bobbed on the vast black sea. Whether Rod made the boat or the trickster made it, no one ever quite says. The important thing is that suddenly there was a place to stand, a little island of order in the middle of the endless, and two beings who knew that they were separate from the ocean beneath them and the sky above. They sat together in that fragile boat, Rod and the dark companion, as the endless water swayed around them. For a time they were silent, each measuring the other. It was the trickster who spoke first. The stories describe him as smiling, teeth white in the gloom, voice soft as the lap of water against wood. He asked Rod why he had called himself into being if he intended to sit forever in a boat on an empty sea. It was an insolent question. Gods are not often asked why they exist, yet Rod did not strike him for it. He looked at the black water and at the blank sky, and he admitted that he desired more. He wanted land under his feet, stars above his head, a place where things could live and die and change. It is a dangerous thing when a creator admits his longing. Creation tends to follow. The trickster leaned closer and confided a secret that was not yet a secret, because nothing had happened enough times for experience to exist. He claimed that he knew how to make land appear. Rod listened. The plan was simple, as the greatest tools often are. Somewhere deep beneath the surface of the endless sea lay the raw material of the world, the sand that could become earth if someone carried it up. Rod was the first, but he was not yet skilled in such work. The clever spirit offered to dive down for him. Rod agreed, because even gods, at the beginning of all things, sometimes trust what they should not. So the Dark One stood up in the boat, and without another word, plunged into the black water. The sea closed over his head. He sank down and down, where the pressure crushed and the cold grew sharp as knives, until he reached the bottom no one had ever seen before. There, the stories say, he found not a blank emptiness, but a bed of fine sand, bright and heavy and full of power. He scooped up a handful of it, and thought a thought that would mean nothing to anyone, but everything to him. If he brought it all back, the world would belong to Rod. If he kept a little hidden, there might one day be a corner of creation that was his alone. That is how it always begins with tricksters and devils in Slavic tales. Not with outright rebellion, but with a secret handful of something tucked away. He rose back toward the surface with his fists full of sand and his mouth clenched shut, his cheeks puffed. He broke through the water with a gasp and climbed back into the small boat, dripping and triumphant. In his hands lay the first solid matter that had ever existed, grains that glittered faintly even in the dark. Rod took the sand without suspicion and spread it carefully over the surface of the water. As he did, the grains did not sink. They floated, then they thickened, then they knit together and grew. Before the boat, the first patch of land appeared, small but firm, an island in the endless sea. The hull scraped against it as the wave lifted them, and suddenly the boat ran aground. Rod stepped out and felt the new earth under his bare feet, rough and real. The first ground had been made. The clever spirit stepped out beside him, his face still strained as he held something in his mouth. No story says exactly how much sand he hid there. Some say just a pinch. Some say a whole mouthful stacked against his teeth like a smuggled treasure. It does not matter. What matters is that the betrayal had already begun. Rod, pleased with their work, lay down on the tiny patch of earth to rest. It had been a long labour, creating oneself and a companion and a first island in a single beginning. The god closed his eyes and slept, his head near one edge of the land and his feet near the other. The trickster watched him for a while, his tongue pushing against the grains of hidden sand, and something dark and eager grew inside him. He thought, "If I push him off, this land will be mine alone." So he placed his shoulder against Rod and tried to roll him into the sea. But the moment he heaved, the island did not tilt or break. Instead, the edge that would have sunk stretched out. The land lengthened. What had been a narrow strip grew in that direction, pushing like a tongue into the black water. The trickster stumbled, surprised. He tried again from another angle, bracing his feet and shoving with all his strength against the sleeping god. Once more the island did not give. It expanded. It grew outward in a new direction, swelling and hardening, adding hills and ridges where there had been only flatness. It was as if every effort to be rid of Rod only gave him more room to lie upon. If you imagine the world as a circle on a map, this is the moment the storytellers point to when they explain why the land has corners, why there are long stretches of plains in one place and mountain chains in another. The Dark One tried again and again to overturn the Creator, and each attempt pushed the edges of the island farther outward, creating north and south, east and west. Where he strained the hardest, the sand clumped and rose into ranges of stone. Where his strength faltered, the world spread thin and flat. In his mouth the hidden sand rubbed his gums raw, but he did not spit it out. Greed and envy held it there, the first unclean thoughts in a newborn cosmos. When Rod finally woke, he did not rise on a little island. He stood up on a broad stretch of land that reached farther than his eye could see, still bordered on all sides by the old Black Sea, but now already showing the curves of valleys and the bare bones of future mountains. He understood at once that something had happened while he slept. Gods who create are sensitive to shape. He also understood what his companion had tried to do. A creator can be patient, but there is a line even a patient god will not see crossed without anger. Rod looked at the trickster, saw the grains of stolen sand clinging to his lips, and knew that he was dealing not with a loyal helper, but with a rival already dreaming of his own kingdom. There are different versions of what happened next. Some say Rod spoke, and the words themselves were heavier than stone, pressing the betrayer down. Others say he stretched out his hand, and lightning appeared for the first time, white and fierce, lancing from the empty sky to the earth. The bolt struck the Dark One and hurled him from the surface, burning away his false human shape and revealing something older beneath, something scaled and coiled and full of hunger. He slipped into a crack that opened in the newborn ground and fell back toward the depths, not into water this time, but into a dark space beneath the land, a hollow realm that had not existed until the moment he needed somewhere to fall to. In that way, by punishment, the underworld was created. Rod stood at the edge of the new chasm and peered down. He did not see the Dark One, but he felt his presence below, sulking and plotting. The god understood that the world he had made could not be made empty of darkness. He could hurl a traitor down, but the traitor would still exist somewhere, forever pushing up from beneath. That was when Rod separated what had been one flat realm into three. Above him he raised the sky higher, turning the empty vault into the shining world of divine law and order. This he called Prav, the realm where the will of the gods would be clear and unbroken. Beneath his feet he fixed the middle realm, the world of things that could be seen and touched, of rivers and stones and living beings. This he called Yav, the realm of what is. And below, where the Dark One fell, where shadows pooled and strange roots reached down into unseen soil, he recognized the realm of what is hidden, of the dead and the not yet born. This was Nav, the underworld, a place he did not love but accepted as part of the whole. With that simple act of naming, the cosmos took on its structure. The sky above, the world in the middle, the deep dark below. The boat that had once floated on the endless sea was now stranded on a firm shore. The sea itself was no longer endless. It lapped against coasts and gathered into basins that would one day be called lakes and oceans. Rod walked the length and breadth of the land, his bare feet leaving marks that settled into the first riverbeds. Where his heel pressed, a spring burst forth and began to run. Where his palm rested on a hill, it rose higher. As he moved, he was not simply traveling. He was measuring, waiting, and blessing. Each step and touch taught the newborn world what it meant to be firm, to be fluid, to be high or low. The Dark One was not idle either. In the realm below he explored caverns and hollows, claiming them as his own. He discovered that the sand he had hidden in his mouth had changed. It was no longer willing to float on water and rise to the surface. It had become heavier and more stubborn, rich and dark. He spat it out and watched it pile up in heaps of glistening black soil, veins of precious ore, pockets of shining crystals. These would become his treasures, hidden away under the feet of men and gods. He could not rule the wide world of Yav as he had dreamed, but he could become Lord of everything buried, everything forgotten, everything that lived in shadow. He had fallen, but in falling he had found a different kind of power. Rod knew that leaving him there meant trouble in the ages ahead. Light and dark rarely rest quietly side by side. But he also knew that without shadow, light is blinding and thin. A world with only one force is a world that cracks. So he did not seal Nav completely. Instead, he grew a great axis through all three realms, a living pillar that would touch sky and earth and underworld alike. Some call it a mountain that reaches up into the clouds. Others describe it as a vast tree, its crown in Prav, its trunk in Yav, its roots drinking from Nav. In later tales, this would be the place where the thunder god sits and the serpent god coils. But at this first moment, it was simply the backbone of the world, a way for forces to move and speak to each other without tearing the universe apart. Once the three realms were fixed and connected, Rod turned his attention back to the sky. It still lay empty, a roof without any pattern. He lifted his hands and scattered sparks from his fingers, and they flew upward and stayed there, becoming the first stars. They did not yet move in careful paths. They were more like campfires, seen from far away, reminders that even in the highest darkness there could be points of warmth and light. Looking up at them, Rod felt a kind of satisfaction that even gods rarely taste. He had taken a flat, endless sea and turned it into a world with shape and difference, with above and below, east and west. It was still silent, but it was no longer empty. Down on the surface, the air changed. Before, there had been nothing between water and sky. Now there was a breathable space, a soft and invisible substance that could carry sound and scent. Rod inhaled it and exhaled it, and with each breath the air learned to move. The first wind stirred, gentle at first, then stronger, sweeping over the new-formed hills and plains. They carved the edges of rocks and combed the faces of cliffs that had only just come into being. Later generations would personify these winds as their own deity, a grandfather of breezes and storms, but for now they were simply the breath of a lonely god. Rod did not remain alone for long. The act of creation had stirred something in him that could not be quieted. The more he shaped the world, the more images rose in his mind of other beings who could share the work. He imagined a god who would tend the sky fire, another who would ride the winds, another who would protect the moist earth and the work of human hands that would someday rise upon it. The names had not yet been spoken. Perun, Veles, Mokosh, Svarog, all were still like silhouettes behind a curtain, clear enough in outline that a god could see them, not yet clear enough that anyone else could call upon them. Rod knew that the world he had made would need caretakers, watchers, rulers, guardians, tricksters, lovers. No single being can hold every role without breaking. So he walked the length of Yav one more time, listening. In the curl of a new river, he heard the laughter of a future water spirit. In the stillness of a forest that had not yet grown, he felt the patience of a god who would one day govern roots and leaves. In the empty sky, he foresaw thunder that would one day split it open. Even in the underworld, in the sullen quiet where his betrayer lurked, he sensed the possibility of something more complex than mere malice, a necessary pull downward that would balance the striving upward of life. These were the raw thoughts from which the later pantheon would be formed. Night and day did not yet exist. There was only Rod working and resting, and the black water now parcelled into seas and lakes, and the stars pricking the sky whenever he wished to look upon them. Time itself was still soft. It did not flow in a tidy river, but gathered in pools and eddies around each creative act. In that softness, it is hard to say how long the first god walked the half-finished world before speaking the names of his children. The stories gloss over this because there are no human witnesses to report it, only the memory of the land itself, and land speaks slowly. What the tales agree on is that there came a moment when the world was ready to hold more than one mind. The sea had its basins, the sky had its fire seeds, the underworld had its coiled lord in the dark. The great tree or mountain stood with its roots deep and its crown high, binding everything together. The stages were built, the curtains were hung. Rod sat beside a river that had just learned to sing quietly over its stones and looked at his reflection in the water. He saw not only his own face, but the suggestion of other faces layered behind it, as if the world itself were offering him templates. He spoke again, not his own name this time, but a new word. That word was Svarog, and with it came the first of his children, who would light the forge of the heavens and shape the things that Rod had only sketched. Others would follow. A thunderer who would claim the high places and guard Prov with weapon in hand. A god of the deep earth who would walk in the shadows of Nav and grow horns and scales as he pleased. A mother who would hold the moist soil and the work of human hands in her care. A giver of sun, a stirrer of winds, a watcher of doors between night and day. But those are tales for another chapter. For now, the important thing is this. The world of the Slavs begins not with a finished pantheon marching in order across a perfect stage, but with a single god in a boat on a black ocean, a clever companion whose first act is betrayal, a handful of sand, and a struggle that stretches a tiny island into a vast world. It begins with the separation of realms, with the understanding that there must be a sky above and a darkness below and a fragile place in the middle where everything that matters will happen. It begins with the first breath, the first lie, the first punishment, and the first acceptance that light and shadow are both here to stay. When Rod spoke the new name into the world, the air itself shuddered. It was not the raw first word that had birthed the sea and the sky, but something narrower and hotter, a name like a glowing coal. The sound of it seemed to ring against the empty stars. Svarog. The river beside Rod fell quiet, as if listening. The wind held its breath. For a moment nothing happened, and then the air above the water thickened, as if an invisible hand were twisting it together. A shape stepped out of that knot of brightness and took weight upon the young earth. Svarog stood there as if he had always been there. That is the way of gods called into being by a single word. He was not a youth, nor was he ancient. His hair was the color of iron that has been in the fire and then plunged into water, dark with a faint shimmer. His hands were large, with long, clever fingers that already seemed to remember the weight of tools he had never held. When he breathed, the air smelled faintly of coal smoke and hot stone. In his eyes there was a steady, practical light. This was no distant dreamer like Rod had been at the beginning. This was a maker. Rod watched him with the complicated gaze of a father who has suddenly called a grown child into the room. There was pride in that look and a thin thread of unease. The first god had shaped land and sky with bare will and stolen sand. Svarog would do his work differently. This was a god who needed resistance, something to strike and bend and break and make anew. Where Rod saw the whole world at once, Svarog saw details. He looked up at the cold stars scattered like careless sparks and frowned. They were pretty, yes, but they were too small, too far, too weak to warm the land below. He looked at the rivers and the empty valleys, waiting for life, and shook his head. There was no fire in this world yet, not the right kind. Without it, nothing would ripen, Nothing would cook, nothing would be forged. The first thing Svarog did was search for stone. He walked, while Rod watched, to the place where the world tree or world mountain rose from the new ground. Its lower slopes were naked rock, still showing the marks of Rod's hands, rough and raw. Svarog knelt and touched the stone. He pressed his palm against it, until a faint glow began to spread from his skin into the mountain. Under his touch, the rock softened just enough to be shaped. He dug his fingers into it as a potter digs into clay and carved out a wide cave near the base of the great axis, a hollow chamber whose walls were streaked with ore. This would be his first forge. When he stepped back, the cavern shone with a dull inner light. It was not yet a fire, it was potential. Svarog gathered fallen branches and laid them in the center of the stone floor. He spoke a few soft words that no one but he and Rod heard, and with those words he called down one of the stray sparks that still wandered in the sky from the moment Rod had scattered them. It fell like a tiny star, landed among the wood, and caught. Flame rose. Not the cold lightning of punishment that had hurled the Dark One into Nav, but a warm, living fire that clung to the sticks and ate them with a crackle and a sigh. This was the first hearth. Rod felt the heat on his face and understood that the world had changed again. Fire had appeared in it as friend, not just as weapon. In the chapters to come, men would gather around such flames and tell these stories, but for now the fire belonged to Svarog alone. He studied it with the patience of a master who has found his true material. He fed it, coaxed it higher, then tamed it back down, learning its moods. When he was satisfied, he reached into the stone of the mountain itself and drew out veins of glowing metal, red and gold and white, like the blood and bones of the very earth. He laid those on the fire, and they softened and ran. With his bare hands he shaped the molten stuff into the first tools. Out of that glowing metal, Svarog made a hammer that fit his grip so well it looked like an extension of his arm. He fashioned tongs that could hold anything without burning. He made an anvil, a block of impossibly dense stone that fell from his hand onto the floor with a sound like the end of the world. The impact shook the mountain and sent tremors up the trunk of the world tree. In the sky, the newborn stars trembled and rang in answer. Down in Nav, where the Dark One lurked nursing his anger, he felt the vibrations and understood that someone above had begun to build. Now that he had a proper forge, Svarog began to work in earnest. The heat grew fierce, roaring like a trapped beast in the cave, but he did not flinch. He raised the hammer and brought it down on the metal again and again, each strike sending showers of sparks into the air. Some of those sparks fled out through the mouth of the cavern and shot up into the sky, where they hung and cooled and became fixed lights. Thousands of them. In later ages, people would look up and tell each other that the Milky Way was the trail of sparks from Svarog's forge, frozen on the roof of the world. Out of the larger pieces of metal, he shaped more than tools. He was the first to imagine that the sky itself could be a crafted thing. He took a vast sheet of glowing white gold and beat it into a great disk. With careful blows he domed that disk, and thickened its center until it looked like a shield large enough for a god, polished and radiant. He quenched it in water drawn from the deepest river, and when he lifted it again, it burned with its own light, not the pale light of the stars, but a fierce golden blaze. This was the first sun. It needed a bearer. Svarog carried the sun disk up out of his forge and into the open air. Rod watched him climb the flank of the world mountain, that burning thing held in his hands like a newborn. When he reached the first plateau, he called out to his father and to the still forming wind. His voice rolled out over the empty land like distant thunder, though thunder as yet had no owner. He cried that the world would be cold and dead, without a great fire in the sky, but a fire that sat still in one place would scorch one side of the earth and leave the other in darkness. The sun must move. It must ride. Rod listened and nodded. He knew this too. He had not yet imagined the mechanism. That was why he had called Svarog into being. The smith took the sun and set it in a great chariot that he forged that very day, a wheel-bound frame of metal and light. He made horses for it as well, not beasts of flesh, but forms of flame and daylight, their manes bright as noon, their hooves sparks on stone. He needed someone to hold the reins. A different kind of god, one who loved the open sky and the feeling of movement. Svarog went back into his forge, and out of the smaller, brighter fragments of the same metal he had used for the sun, he shaped a new being. This one was slender and radiant, with hair like rays and eyes the color of dawn. When he exhaled, warmth spread through the cavern. The smith named him Dashbog, which means the giving god, for his role would be to pour light and life upon the world. Where Svarog was a maker who preferred the glow of coals and the steady rhythm of the hammer, Dashbog was all motion and grace. He accepted the chariot from his father with an eager smile. The first dawn was a clumsy thing. The horses had never run. The chariot had never rolled. Dashbog climbed aboard and gripped the reins, and for a heartbeat nothing happened, as if even the world itself were too startled to move. Then the horses bolted. The chariot shot forward, dragging the new sun across the sky in a blazing arc. The light that spilled from it struck the land like a blessing and a blow at once. Rocks glittered. River surfaces flashed with gold. The air warmed. In Rod's chest something eased that he had not known was tight before. This was what the world had been missing. Fire above to answer fire below. But the first day nearly ended in disaster. Dashbog, drunk on speed and light, drove his team too low. The edges of the world island began to char where the sun came too close. Svarog saw it, and with Rod beside him shouted. The call of the first god and the first smith together reached even that speeding chariot. Dashbog wrestled the reins upward with all his will. The horses reared, and the sun climbed, and the burning path that would later become a steady course jerked and shuddered. The chariot finally slipped behind the western rim of the world, plunging down toward the dark sea, and the light went out. The land screamed at the sudden loss. Everything that had been painted gold turned grey and then black. The river sang a softer song. The wind exhaled the last warmth, and turned cool again. This was the first night. The gods stood on the mountain and looked at one another and at the empty sky. They had discovered by accident that the world needed not only light, but darkness. Creatures that would one day crawl and walk and think would need both, work and rest, growth and sleep, fire and coolness. So the cycle of day and night began, not as a measured clock, but as the aftershock of a misjudged ride. Dashbog emerged, crawling from the sea, soaked but alive, dragging the sun disk like a wounded shield behind him. Svarog and Rod hauled him back up the slopes and listened to him babble with excitement about what he had seen, the curve of the earth, the way the light poured over peaks and into valleys, the strange feeling that at the highest point of his flight the world looked almost small. They could have punished him for scorching the edges of creation and for plunging them all into darkness. They did not. They told him instead to try again the next day, but to trace a more careful path. If you imagine that in those early times the sun wobbled and swung erratically across the sky, sometimes lingering long, sometimes darting too fast, you will be very close to the picture the old tales give when they speak of the world before it settled into its rhythms. Once Dashbog and his horses had rested, and Svarog had inspected the chariot for cracks, the smith went back to his forge. The sky had fire now, but the world was still too still. It needed movement that was not light. It needed breath that was not Rod's alone. So Svarog drew out of the air, and the subtle currents he had felt while the sun raced overhead a thickening pressure, and he gave it shape. This time, what formed beside his anvil was an old man, lean and bony, with a beard like mist and hair that moved as if under water. When he opened his mouth, the sound that came out made the flames in the forge bend and the smoke curl sideways. Svarog named him Stribog, grandfather of winds. Strybog walked out of the cavern and onto the mountain slope and inhaled. The air rushed into him with a hiss. He held it for a moment, tasting every flavor of new world in it, and then he blew it out. The exhalation rolled down the mountainside and across the plains and rivers, stirring the water, combing the young grass, piling dust and stray grains of sand into little ridges. This was the first true wind that did not rise from Rod's lungs. Strybog laughed. His laugh was a gust. He realized that he could send soft breezes or violent gales, that he could carry clouds and cool the ground after a long day of Dashbog's burn. Rod saw that his children were beginning to fill in the gaps that he had left, and felt a mixture of relief and the melancholy that comes with knowing that one is no longer the only necessary being in the universe. He thought again of the dark god in Nav, who had been flung there by his wrath. Even that one, he realized, had a part to play. For what is a world of fire and air and light, without depth and shadow, and the mystery of what lies beneath the feet? So he called another name. This time he did not shape the god in the clean air of Prav or in the glow of Svarog's forge. He whispered it down the roots of the world tree, into the cracks in the hills, into the trickle of water that vanished into underground channels. Velis. The name went down like a stone dropped into a well. In the deep, where the Dark One had been pacing among his piles of rich soil and veins of ore, it exploded like a new vein of heat. Veles was not truly a new god. He was the old betrayer, given a more precise form and a place in the order of things. When the name reached him, his body twisted and grew. Horns sprouted from his brow. His shoulders broadened, fur spreading over them like a cloak. His legs grew heavy, hooved. His fingers thickened into claws that could dig and grasp. At will he could smooth his shape into something almost human or unravel into a serpent and a shadow. He felt the roots of the world tree brushing his back and the weight of the earth above pressing down, and instead of hating it, he smiled a slow, secret smile. This depth was his. The buried riches were his. Creatures that walked the middle realm would look up and praise the thunder god one day, but when they wanted wealth and cattle and hidden knowledge, it would be his name they muttered over cups of ale in the dark. He knew this in his bones. On the surface, Rod and Svarog both felt his answering laugh through the soles of their feet. It was not a comforting sound. Still, Rod did not take the name back. The time when he could unmake things so easily was passing. The more the world filled with beings and roles, the more it began to behave like a living story rather than a set of tools. You do not rip characters out of such a story without tearing the cloth. There was one more gap that cried out to be filled. The land had fire and light and air and shadow, but it did not yet have a presence that was of the soil itself, a power that was not above or below, but deeply and intimately of the middle realm. Rod thought of the moist ground beneath his bare feet, of the springs that bubbled up when his heel pressed down, of the way the world would someday need to bear not only grass and trees, but grain and children. He thought of his own loneliness at the beginning, so he spoke again, this time in a tone of voice as soft as rain soaking into ploughed fields. Out of the damp earth at his feet, a figure rose. At first it was only a shape like a woman made of mud and water, tall and thick and strong. As Rod and Svarog and even Strybog watched, her features became more clear. Her hair fell heavy around her shoulders like riverweed. Her hands were wide and capable. Her eyes were dark and deep and patient. She smelled of wet soil and wool and the steam that rises from hot bread. She shook herself, and the clinging clods fell away, leaving skin the colour of fertile ground. Rod named her Mokosh. When Mokosh walked, the places her bare soles touched became richer. Grasses sprang up behind her without her meaning to call them. Where her fingers brushed rock, moss followed in their trail. She went first to Svarog's forge and warmed her palms over the fire, not because she needed heat, but because she understood in some quiet way that one day people would gather there, and she would be there with them, watching their work. Then she went down the mountain to where a river bent to form a small natural clearing and knelt. She pressed her hands into the mud by the water and began to smooth it, humming under her breath. Without looking at Rod, she asked who would live here. He told her, not in strict detail, but in hints and half-formed ideas. There would be creatures that walked upright and carried burdens and made things and ruined things and wept and laughed and sowed and reaped. They would need someone to watch over their labor and their families, especially over the slow and dangerous work of carrying new life into the world. Mokosh listened. She said nothing for a long time. Eventually she nodded, as if accepting a task she had always known was hers, but had waited to have spoken aloud. From then on, the land beneath her care was not just soil, but a promise. The young pantheon gathered at last, near the summit of the World Mountain. Rod stood at its highest point, with Svarog at his right hand and Mokosh at his left. Dashbog lounged not far away, his chariot tethered to a stone ring by glowing reins, the horses stamping and snorting little clouds of light. Strybog paced back and forth, restless, his beard blowing in winds that only he felt. Somewhere unseen, Veles coiled around the roots below, listening through the stone. The stars above flickered like the eyes of distant witnesses. This was the first council of the gods. Rod spoke to them, not as the all-powerful solitary maker he had been at the start, but as the first among many. He laid out before them the shape of the world as it stood, the three realms. The seas that still needed, shores and names. The forests that had yet to grow. The empty spaces where rivers could still choose their beds. He told them that he would not be the only one to guide all this. Each of them would have a domain and a duty. Svarog would keep the forge and the sacred fire and oversee the making of tools and the shaping of the sky. Dashbog would ride the sun and see that day and night followed one another in a steady rhythm. Strybog would send winds across plains and seas, carrying clouds and shaping weather. Veles, uninvited but heard, would be lord of the deep earth and the hidden, of cattle and wealth and oaths and the restless dead. Mokosh would care for the soil of Yav and for the labor and fate of those who would work it. They accepted these roles not as employees accept tasks in a tidy order, but as wolves accept woods and rivers accept valleys. The domains fit them. They were what they had been born from and for. Svarog looked at the sky and already imagined constellations as patterns hammered into a great dome. Dashbog glanced east, thinking of how to make his horses leap from that horizon each morning without tearing the sky. Strybog tested how hard he could blow without flattening the young mountains. Veles ran his claws through the veins of ore and smiled. Mokosh pressed her hand to the mountain rock and sent a shiver of growth running down its slopes. Yet there was one more presence waiting to be named. Rod felt it circling above, a potential that was not yet fixed. It was the taste of metal on the tongue in a storm. It was the tension that builds in the sky before lightning falls. It was justice and fury and the fierce joy of a fight. It was the need for someone to stand at the highest point and shout back at whatever dared threaten the fragile balance of the three realms. Rod drew in a deep breath and spoke one last name that day. Perun. The sky answered, before any form did. A low rumble rolled across the firmament, as if the clouds were clearing their throats. Then a blaze of light split the heavens. It was not the warm light of Dashbog's sun. It was white and searing, a crooked spear of fire that lanced from cloud to mountaintop and struck a huge oak that had just begun to grow there. The tree burst into flame and then stood, blackened and smoking, but unbroken. Out of the smoke stepped a figure. Perun was tall and broad-shouldered, with hair the colour of storm clouds and a beard like dark rain. His eyes were the harsh blue-grey of distant thunderheads. In his fist he held a weapon that looked at first like a hammer, and then like an axe, and then like a stone, as if it could be any of these depending on who was looking and what was needed. The air around him smelled of ozone and wet earth. He planted his feet on the highest rock of the world mountain and looked around at the gathered gods and at the distant line where the sea met the sky. His gaze lingered for a moment on the blackened trunk of the oak he had just struck and then lifted to the clouds, already gathering above him like loyal hounds. Rod saw in him both a son and an answer. The world needed fire from above, and Dazbog gave that. It needed the softer movement of air, and Strybog tended that. It needed the deep shadow, and Veles had claimed that. But it also needed a guardian who would stand in the breach when chaos rose, who would split the sky to remind everyone that there were laws here now, ordained in Prov and carried out in Yav. Perun was that. The other gods greeted him in their ways. Svarog nodded with the respect of one craftsman for another, because he could see in Perun's weapon the same metal he himself had worked, now changed by another hand. Dazbog grinned, sensing in this Stormbringer a fellow lover of the wide sky. Strybog circled him like a curious dog, gusts swirling around the new thunder god and ruffling his hair. Mokosh watched him quietly, calculating what his storms would do to her fields, how his rains would feed her soil, how often his lightning would split her trees. Below, Veles listened and bared his teeth, already thinking of ways to test and taunt this loud newcomer. Perun looked down through the rock and root and met that unseen gaze with one of his own. For a heartbeat, the world held two wills in perfect opposition, one above and one below. No one spoke. The first tension between them stretched like a cord. It did not snap that day. It settled into place, ready to be tugged in times to come. The story of their struggle would shape storms and seasons and the way people understood every clash in their own lives. The sun moved. Strybog sent a soft breeze across the mountain. Mokosh crouched and splayed her fingers over the soil, feeling it vibrate with the presence of so many powers. Rod stepped back, not in fear, but in a strange, profound relief. He had called the world into being. Now the world had others who would keep it moving, who would argue and clash and love and build and sometimes break and then mend. Creation had shifted from being a solitary task to a shared burden. Far below, in the liquid dark of Nav, Veles ran his hand over the flank of some unseen beast of the deep and began to plan. Far above, in the bright chill of Prav, Perun rolled his shoulders and lifted his weapon, testing the weight. Between them lay Yav with its rivers and plains and future forests, its empty villages waiting to be built, its people not yet born. The forge of heaven was lit. The first gods stood in their places. The story was no longer a simple tale of one maker and one betrayer. It had become a cast of characters, each with desires and duties, each ready to pull the world in a different direction. In the high places of the world, where the air was thin and sharp, and the clouds moved like great slow herds across the sky, Perun chose his seat. The world mountain rose out of the land like the spine of a buried giant, its summit crowned with a single oak that had survived his first strike of lightning and carried the scar of it in its blackened bark. Perun stood beneath that oak, boots planted in the stone, and claimed it without ceremony. He was not a god of long speeches. His very presence felt like a storm held in human form, the restless charge before thunder bursts. Around him, the sky responded. Grey banks of cloud gathered, not as a curtain to block him from sight, but as a cloak that wrapped his shoulders. When he breathed, mist curled. When he flexed his hand on the haft of his weapon, distant sparks flickered where sky met land. Far below that summit, in the hidden chambers of Nav, Veles also found a place that felt like his own. The underworld was no simple pit of fire. It was a many-chambered realm, full of caverns and slow rivers that ran through rock, full of roots that reached down like curious fingers from the world above. In one of those deep halls, where the ceiling glimmered with pale crystals and the floor was carpeted with rich dark soil, Veles lay coiled around a hoard that was entirely his. There were veins of copper and silver and gold there, seams of salt, lumps of iron ore, fossil bones turned to stone, skulls that once belonged to beasts and men. Above his hulking animal shape, small lights drifted like will-wisp lanterns. He could feel, always, the weight of the world pressing down from above, could hear through the rock the distant rumble that marked Perun shifting his stance on the mountain, that marked Svarog raising his hammer, that marked Dashbog's chariot beginning its daily climb. He knew he could not sit on the highest peak, but he could own everything beneath it. Between these two seats of power stretched Yav, the visible world of mortals and growing things. It was here that their rivalry would play out. It would be easy to imagine that they simply hated each other, that light despised dark and sky despised depth. The truth in the old stories is more complicated and more interesting. Perun needed something to push against, some resistance that would make his thunder meaningful. Veles needed someone to rage against, some boundary he could test and break and rebuild, so that his realm would never grow stale. Their hatred, if hatred it can be called, was also a kind of dependence. At first there was no war, only wary awareness. Perun spent his days learning the reach of his strength. He hurled bolts of white fire into the empty sky and watched how far they could leap. He slammed his weapon against flat rock and split it, listening to the way the crack sounded as it ran down into the depths. He learned that his favorite tree, the oak on the mountain, did not die from his strikes, but hardened and twisted. Its grain burned into patterns like writing. This was pleasing. He began to watch the young forests that Mokosh coaxed up from the soil, marking out the tallest oaks as his own. He was not a subtle god. He preferred high places that everyone could see. Veles, meanwhile, explored the low and the hidden. He swam through underground lakes where pale fish flickered and vanished. He moved along the roots of the world tree and felt where they pushed into rivers and ponds in the land above. Wherever water widened, he left a little of himself. Snakes began to appear on muddy banks. Bulls grazed in the dark meadows of Nav, and on the pasture lands of Yav, when cattle finally came into existence. Veles liked creatures with horns and hooves, creatures whose breath steamed in the chill morning air and whose flesh was heavy and valuable. They belonged to him in a way that he did not bother to explain to anyone. Wealth attracted him. So did the soft shining of coin and jewel. In later ages, when men began to tally their herds and bury treasures, it would be his whisper in their ear, urging them to hide a little from the neighbors and the gods. The first open clash between sky and underworld came, not as some grand decision in a council of gods, but from a theft. That is how it often begins in Slavic stories, with something stolen and someone enraged. In the early times, when the gods still walked openly through Yav, Perun owned a great herd of divine cattle. These were no ordinary beasts. They grazed on cloud and mist on the high slopes of the world mountain, their coats white as fresh snow or dark as thunderheads, their horns tipped with shining light. When they moved, their hooves left prints in the air itself, and the sound of their bells was like distant rolling thunder. Perun loved this herd in the way a warrior can love the only soft thing he owns. They were his wealth, his pride, and his solitude made flesh. Veles looked up from the shadowed world below and saw them. From where he lay in Nav, the cattle above looked like drifting bright shapes through the stone, moving slowly along the mountain. To a god of the underworld and livestock, this was a temptation almost too perfect. He told himself that Perun had more than he needed, that the sky god cared more for the flash of lightning and the crash of battle than for the slow, quiet work of tending herds. It would not truly hurt anyone if a few of those shining cattle came down to graze in the rich meadows of the underworld. He could take them, the world would not end. Besides, he added, as tricksters always do, it would be amusing to see the proud Thunder, Lord Thunder, with something other than self-importance for once. So Veles began to climb. He did not do it in his full, horned and furred shape. That would have drawn Perun's eye at once. Instead, he took the form of a serpent, long and sinuous, his scales slick as wet clay. He slithered up the roots of the world tree, coiled through cracks in the mountainside, and emerged at last among the high meadows where the sky cattle grazed. The air there was thin and electric. His tongue tasted the charge of Perun's presence like salt. The herd snorted and shifted, uneasy, but they did not flee. Perhaps they had never seen such a serpent before. Perhaps they did not understand yet that the underworld had teeth. In some tellings of the story, Veles steals the cattle themselves, thick-necked and snorting, driving them with soft hisses toward the cracks in the rock that lead back down. In others, he steals something even more precious, one of Perun's children, or even the Thunderer's radiant wife, leading them away with honeyed words and illusions. There are village songs where people swear that Veles took Perun's golden son and hid him in the roots of a tree, and that thunder is the sound of a desperate father calling for his lost child. Myth, like river water, takes different paths through the same valley. What matters is that something beloved is taken from the heights and carried downward into places where light does not reach. The moment Perun understood what had happened, the sky changed. It had been a clear day. Thin white clouds drifted, peaceful as Perun's cattle. Then they stopped drifting and began to gather. The blue of the sky darkened, as if a bruise spread across its face. Birds went quiet. On the mountain, the oak trembled and dropped a shower of leaves. Perun himself felt something in his chest that was not the calm readiness of a warrior, nor the steady attention of a guardian. It was a hot, cold spike of outrage that turned almost at once into resolve. His hand closed on his weapon. He did not call a council. He did not send a messenger. He strode toward the edge of the summit and looked down into the world. From that height his eyes were like fire. They saw the path the serpent had taken, even though Veles had been careful, even though he had hidden among roots and stones and the nesting places of small birds. Perun saw the faint shimmer where his cows had passed, or where the stolen child had been dragged. He saw how the trail slipped into a cleft in the rock and vanished there, going down, down, down. He understood at once who was responsible. Veles. The name tasted bitter in his mouth. When he raised his arm, the clouds answered. The first bolt of true thunderfire flew from his hand and struck the mountainside. Rock exploded. Trees splintered. A shower of blazing fragments rained down into the valley below. Men and women were not there to see it yet, but spirits were. Leshy, the guardians of the forest, watched from thickets that had only just grown. The river sprites known later as Rusalki peered up through crystal pools and saw the sky itself opening in fury. Even Makosh felt it in her bones as she worked in the lowlands, her fingers pressing seeds into damp soil. She paused and looked up, eyes narrowing. This was not Svarog's forge fire. This was something wilder. Veles, with his stolen wealth pushing at his back, felt the strike too. The shock of it ran through the mountain and into his body where it hugged the rock. He cursed softly, not in fear, but in annoyance. Perun was quicker to anger than he had hoped. He hurried his steps, slithering deeper. The path narrowed and widened again. Water dripped from the roof of the tunnel, cold and mineral. The stolen cattle lowed in panic, their bellies scraping the stone. The stolen child, if you prefer that version, clung to his pale neck, eyes wide in the dark. Veles soothed them with murmurs, promises of rich lower pastures, of safety from the harshness of the sky. He did not believe his own words entirely, but they did not need to be true. They only needed to keep his prizes moving. Above, Perun began the hunt in earnest. If you imagine the sky as a great uneven shield, then each thunderbolt is a blow of his axe upon it. Where he strikes, the charge runs down into the world. He followed the path of his stolen things, the way a hound follows scent, not with nose, but with an instinct for imbalance. Wherever Veles had passed, something small was out of place. A stone was turned. A puddle was stirred. A young tree leaned in the wrong direction. Perun saw these signs without thinking, and hurled his weapon again and again, splitting rocks, blasting stumps, turning whole stands of oak into charred monuments. Veles knew this pattern better than anyone. He had felt the first blow that cast him into Nav. He had tasted the bitter metal of that lightning in his own transformed bones. So as he fled, he used the one advantage he owned. He changed. One moment he was a serpent, sliding along the underground path. The next he was a great horned bull, crashing through a hidden cavern and taking a completely different route among the pillars of stone. When that form grew too large for the narrowing cracks, he became a wolf, his paws silent as shadow on the damp rock. At one point, to fool Perun's watching eye, he left a decoy, a shallow image of himself woven of mist and echo, and hurried in the opposite direction as a simple toad, squat and harmless and dull. There is a motif in almost every Slavic tale of this rivalry. Veles never meets Perun in open battle. That is not his way. He is not a god of fair fights. He is a god of bargains and tricks and sideways moves. He moves from form to form, from place to place, never lingering where a straight strike could find him. Perun never pretends to be anything but what he is. He does not disguise himself. He does not sneak. He simply pursues, relentless, hurling down more thunder. From below, the people who would one day live in wooden villages until narrow strips of soil between forest and marsh would see these events in the sky and hear them in the bones of the earth. Long after men had entered the tale, when storms rolled across their land, they would say that Perun was chasing Veles again, striking at him as he tried to hide in hollow trees or in the bellies of black clouds, in church bells or in roof beams. When lightning hit a barn and the cattle within perished, they would mutter that Veles had gone there first, and Perun had aimed for him and gotten the beasts instead. It was cruel, yes, but it meant that the gods were still active, still working out their ancient quarrel right above the fields where people lived. In those early days before mankind, the chase ended in a place where Yav met Nav most closely. Veles fled out of the dry underworld tunnels into a huge cavern where a river burst from a crack in the rock and poured downward in a roaring white curtain. He plunged into that falling water, his body twisting back into serpent shape to cut the current. The stolen cattle splashed after him in panic, their hooves scrabbling on the slippery stone. The stolen child clung and sobbed. Beyond the curtain of water lay a passage even deeper and darker, a domain where Perun's lightning could not easily reach. Veles gave a hiss of triumph, feeling the cool embrace of his own element sheltering him. Perun saw him from above. He stood on a rocky outcrop, rain lashing his face, looking down into the gorge carved by the same river farther along in its flow. He understood that Veles was trying to disappear into the double realm of earth and water where thunder was blunted. For a moment, just a heartbeat, he considered letting the serpent go. The cattle would be lost. The child would grow up learning Veles songs instead of his. The insult would be permanent, yet the world would not end. The three realms would continue to turn. There is always that moment in such tales when a god could choose restraint and does not. Perun raised his hand and called all the charge of the storm into it. The bolt that fell then was greater than any he had thrown before. It tore through cloud and air and plunged straight into the crown of the world tree. The great trunk shuddered. Its branches flared with ghostly blue light. The current ran down, through root and sap and stone, seeking the place where Veles hid. It found the underground river, leaped into it, and raced along its course, turning the water for an instant into a liquid path of light. It struck the cavern behind the waterfall and blasted it wide open. The curtain of water exploded outward into steam. Veles screamed as the charge ran through his many-layered body, through serpents and bulls and wolves and men, and all the forms he had ever taken. The stolen cattle bawled and dropped to their knees. The stolen child fainted, his hair briefly standing on end like a halo of fire. When the light cleared and the water crashed down again, the cavern had changed. Its walls were fused into glass in some places. Its floor was cracked and pitted. Veles lay half in and half out of the pool, smoke rising from his nostrils. For a moment he seemed as lifeless as stone. Then he moved, slowly, very slowly, and pulled himself fully back into Nav, dragging what he could of his horde with him. He had not been killed. Perun's power was great, but it could not erase a force so deeply woven into the fabric of the world. It could only drive it back. Perun climbed down into the ravaged gorge, not as a slender youth with a shining chariot, but as a grim warrior, his beard soaked, his cloak torn by the wind. He gathered his lost cattle, soothed them with heavy hands, and led them back toward the slopes of the World Mountain. If a child or a wife had been taken, he lifted that fragile body in his arms and carried it upward, his jaw set. Behind him the river foamed, still carrying echoes of the thunderbolt. Above him, the storm began slowly to thin. Somewhere far away, Strybog turned his head and sent a softer wind to blow the darkest clouds apart. The hunt was over for the moment. What remained was not peace. It was a pattern. Perun knew now, with the certainty of experience, that Veles would always covet what was high and bright. Veles knew now, with the lingering ache of burned flesh, that Perun would always answer his thefts with violence. Neither was willing to change. So the world settled into the uneasy rhythm of their rivalry. Every year there would be droughts when Veles would hoard the waters, pulling them into his secret channels deep below, fattening his cattle in the dark while the fields above cracked and begged for rain. And every year there would be storms when Perun would ride the sky and drive the water out of the underworld, hurling bolts that shattered tree and hill and sometimes homes, in order to restore the balance and let the rain fall. When people finally did appear in the story, when the first Slavic tribes cleared small spaces in the forests and built their fenced villages and set up wooden idols on hills, they inherited this ancient quarrel already in progress. They did not see the first theft of cattle. They did not see the cavern blasted into glass. They saw only the sky splitting and the earth shaking, and felt, deep in their ancestral memory, that this was more than mere weather. So they built temples to Perun on high hills, near old oaks that had scars of fire on their trunks. They carved him with a beard and a weapon, surrounded by horses and doves and armed retainers. At river crossings and marsh edges, in places where the ground was uncertain and the water hid secrets, they left gifts for Veles, calling him Volos in some lands, god of cattle and wealth and oath-keeping. When they made sworn promises, They invoked both names, knowing that Perun would strike down an oath-breaker from above and Veles would twist his fortunes from below. In this way, the rivalry between sky and underworld flowed into every corner of their lives. A farmer who heard thunder over his field could imagine that Perun was chasing Veles across his plot, that each lightning strike was one more blow in a feud that began before any plough touched that soil. A herder who lost a cow in a sudden illness might mutter that Veles had taken his due, that the animal had been called back into the god of cattle. A warrior standing on a battlefield under a brewing storm might lift his spear high and shout Perun's name, hoping that the thunder god would notice and send his anger into the enemy ranks instead. Above them all, on the scorched crown of the world mountain, Perun would stand beneath his oak, listening to the earth. Below them all, in the rich silent halls of Nav, Veles would coil among his treasures, listening to the same vibrations from the other side. Between them lay Yav, with its forests full of leshy, its rivers haunted by rusalki, its houses watched by small spirits crouched behind stoves. The world was no longer a neutral stage. It was a field of tension stretched between two immense and opposing wills. When the thunder of Perun and the low grumble of Veles had settled into their uneasy rhythm, when storms no longer tore the world apart, but instead rolled across it like great breathing beasts that came and went with the seasons, the sky itself began to grow more intricate. At first it had been only a vault of blue in the day, and a black roof pricked with careless sparks at night, a stage for Dashbog's fiery flight, and little more. Now, under the slow, patient attention of the gods, it became crowded with purpose. The Slavs who would one day look up from their fields and forests would not see an empty ceiling above their heads. They would see a living court, an ever-turning procession of bright beings who watched, guarded, judged, and sometimes played cruel or tender games with the world below. Dashbog himself was the first to feel the need for order. After the early wild days when his chariot had wobbled and lurched, when sometimes the sun hung too long over the world and sometimes plunged too quickly, he learned the path that suited the land. He rose in the east, climbed toward the zenith, and sank into the west along a curve that his horses could remember. The gods measured the length of that journey and called it a day. Svarog, who loved structure the way a smith loves a good pattern in metal, set marks along that invisible road. He forged faint lines of force that only the heavenly beings could see, guide rails of light that kept Dashbog from straying too high or low. The sun god, restless by nature, grumbled at being so guided, but the world beneath him sighed with relief. Crops cannot ripen in chaos. Rivers cannot find their way to the sea if half the year is boiled to steam, and the other half frozen under a sun that sulks behind the hills. Yet even with the path fixed, Dashbog's work was lonely. Each morning he rose from the far eastern sea, where he spent the night in a palace of red gold at the edge of the world, and each evening he drove, exhausted, into the dark waters of the west, trading the sky for a road through the underworld so that he could return unseen to his starting point. The journey through that western gloom where Nav and the surface world nearly touched was perilous. Unseen things clawed at the wheels of his chariot. Shadowy hands reached out to pluck a ray from the sun disk to dim it forever. In the early days, he fought his way through alone, teeth gritted, horses foaming, his only company the hiss of the dark water and the low murmur of Veles, who enjoyed having the giver of light pass so close to his realm. It was Rod who finally decided that a guardian would be needed, or perhaps it was Dashbog himself who begged for a companion. Either way, the answer came in the form of a star. The Slavic peoples had many names for dawn, but one of the most ancient is Zoria, the Shining. When Rod spoke that name for the first time, it fell not on earth or in water, but into the thin air at the very margin of night and day. There, where the black of the sky was already just starting to soften, a figure rose as if she were being breathed out of the darkness by the approaching light. At first, she was only a brightness, a single star that burned more fiercely than its fellows. Then she unfolded like a flower. She was young, slender, and tall, with hair the colour of the very first ray that breaks over a horizon, and eyes that held the faint pallor of the morning sky before it is dyed blue. The eastern breeze took hold of her long robe and turned it into a little banner of pale gold. The gods looked at her and knew that the face of dawn would never again be just light. It would be a person, and a person could watch, could speak, could care. This was Zoria Utrenyaya, the morning star, the first of the star maidens. Her home would be at the gate of the eastern sky, at the place where the road of Dashbog's chariot rose from the underworld sea and climbed into the view of the world. No one had realized there was a gate there until she appeared beside it, slender hands resting on its invisible bars. Her task was simple and enormous. Each morning she was to awaken the gate, unlock it with a gesture, and swing it wide so that Dashbog could ride through. More than that, she was to look upon the face of the returning sun god after his night passage and see if there were marks on him that did not belong to him. A scratch from some underworld beast, a missing spark that might hint that something had been stolen, a weariness that came from more than the simple toil of a god doing his duty. If she saw any of these things, she was to warn him and to call, if need be, upon Perun or Svarog or even Rod himself. In that way, the first line of defense against the darkness below was not thunder or fire, but the quiet, watchful gaze of a maiden who greeted the day. Often, in the stories that old women would later tell on long winter nights, Zoria Utrenyaya and Dashbog are lovers. It is perhaps inevitable. She is the first light of his day, the one who sees him before anyone else does, when he is still half cloaked in night and fumes of the underworld. In some songs he arrives at the gate bruised and smoke-stained, and she lays a cool hand against his cheek, smoothing away the marks. In others, their relationship is more formal, more like that between a devoted attendant and a proud yet weary lord. However people chose to frame it, the cosmic fact remained. Without her, dawn would be a blind, mechanical lifting of the sun over the edge of the world. With her, it became an event, a meeting, a moment that could be welcomed. Balance demands symmetry. If there is a maiden at the eastern gate to open the road for Dashbog, there must be another at the western gate to close it when he is gone. So in time there appeared a second Zoria, born of the same breath in which Rod had spoken the first name, but settling at the other end of the sky. Zoria Vechernaya, the evening star, emerged in the deepening blue just after the sun had fallen. Her hair was darker than her sister's, deep copper and crimson braided together, like the streaks of sunset on the underside of clouds. Her gown was the dusky violet of a sky that is almost night. While her sister greeted the brightening world, this Zoria stood at the western gate with keys in her hand, smiling a little sadly as Dashbog's chariot came rattling in, horses blowing hard. She listened to his account of the day, which was often less about the turning of the world and more about whatever small insult or triumph had caught his eye. The gods are not above pettiness in these stories. She soothed his temper when he complained that Strybog had raised too much dust over a plain, or that Perun had filled the sky with storm clouds that stole all the applause. She watched carefully as he plunged the chariot off the edge and into the hidden road, making sure no malignant underworld thing clung to the rails or the horses' tails. Then she shut the gate behind him and locked it with a click that could be heard only by those who knew how to listen. The Slavs would later say that the first star they saw in the evening was the eye of Zoria Vechernaya, looking down to make sure the world settled properly into night. Some traditions speak of a third Zoria, one who stands at midnight. Zoria Polonochnaya is more shadow than light. She does not show herself often. When she does, she is as pale and still as frost on a winter window pane, hair black as a moonless sky, eyes filled with far-off starlight. Her place is not at a gate in the sky, but at the very point where the day is split in half, at the pivot on which the night turns. If you imagine the hours as a circle, she is the point directly opposite noon. Her duty is to stand guard when even gods are inclined to sleep. While Zoria Utrenyaya watches Dashbog rise and Zoria Vechernaya watches him set, Zoria Polonochnaya listens for the creak of chains around the neck of a beast that must never be allowed to move freely. For there is something else in the Slavic sky, besides sun and moon and stars, something dangerous and always hungry. Near the still place in the heavens that others call the North Star, the Slavs imagined a great spectral hound chained to that immovable point. In some tales he is a dragon, with wings like tattered banners and jaws, big enough to swallow constellations. In others, he takes the more humble shape of a huge dog or wolf, with eyes that burn cold. His name varies from region to region, and sometimes he is fused with the figure of Simagol, a winged dog or lion that accompanies the gods of the sun. What does not vary is his desire. He wants to break his chain and devour the sky. You can see the logic in it if you think like a storyteller who has spent long nights staring up at the stars. There is that one fixed point in the north, around which everything else appears to turn. If you imagine a massive creature tethered there, you picture it straining and circling, pulling as hard as it can, while the chain groans. The Zoria sisters are, among other things, the keepers of that chain. Zoria Utrenyaya checks the links when she opens the eastern gate, her pale hand brushing along the line of light that runs across the heavens. Zoria Vechernaya inspects it when she closes the western gate, making sure no link has cracked under the strain of a day. Zoria Polunochnaya watches it at the only time when everyone else is most likely to be inattentive. The three of them together make sure that the beast at the center of the sky never quite succeeds in his slow, patient work. The Slavs said that if the chain ever broke entirely, the hound would leap among the stars and devour them, starting with the great wagon that people in other lands call the Great Bear. Darkness without stars would fall, a darkness so complete that even Dazhbog's sun chariot would not be able to find its road at dawn. It is a simple and terrible image, the end of all visible order. So when people saw the shifting bands of dim light, sometimes dancing near the horizon at high latitudes, when they saw unusual flickers or wandering stars that did not behave as they should, they could whisper that the chain was straining, that the star maidens had a hard night ahead. While all this played out above, the moon came into his own, quieter dominion. Mysiats, the moon, was not born in a flash like Perun, nor forged like the sun. His origin myths are softer and more tangled. In some tales he is a brother to Dazhbog, a second son of Svarog, made of the cooler metal and set to rule the night. In others he is a wandering male spirit who wooed the sun herself and was punished for loving what he could never truly have. What remains constant is that he is male, which surprises people raised on other mythologies where the moon is often a goddess. The Slavs looked up and saw in that calm silver face not the fertility of a mother, but the quiet thoughtfulness of a man walking alone. The moon does not blaze like the sun. He reflects and softens. His light allows things to be seen without revealing them completely, which is a quality that fits well with the work of spirits and witches and all those who thrive in ambiguity. The phases of Mysiats gave the old storytellers much to work with. When he is full, round and bright, they said he was in favour with his kin, plump with their goodwill. When he wanes, thin to a crescent, they said he had fallen afoul of the sun or of the star maidens, that some quarrel in the celestial family had left him battered, his light torn away piece by piece. One persistent legend says that Mysiats was married to Zoria, or in some places to the sun goddess herself, and that his dalliances with other stars earned him repeated beatings. Each month he swells with regained grace, and then is struck again, a cycle written in the sky so plainly that even illiterate shepherds could read it. There is a deeper undercurrent to these tales. The moon does not keep the same strict path as the sun. He wanders a little. He rises at different times. Sometimes he is up in the afternoon, pale and distracted, as if he has forgotten his own schedule. Sometimes he is invisible for nights at a stretch, dark new moon crossing the sky unseen. To people who live close to nature, such behavior suggests a being with moods, a god who sometimes keeps quiet company with lovers and travelers, who sometimes hides his face to give the world a truly black night for certain magic to take place, who sometimes grows large and spills his calm light over snow and water so that no one can pretend that the world has ever been completely tamed. The interactions between sun and moon offered endless fodder for explanation. Eclipses, rare and unnerving, demanded story. If the sun vanished in the middle of the day, people said that the hound at the north had managed for a moment to sink his teeth into the burning disk, that the Zorias were fighting desperately to yank it back. If the moon turned red during an eclipse at night, they whispered that he had wandered too close to the borders of Nav, picking up the colour of blood from the rivers there, or that Veles himself had breathed upon him. It was never simply a matter of shadow and angle. It was family drama, cosmic conflict, and the brief triumph of the things that normally lurked outside the circle of steady light. Beneath all these narratives lies a practical observation. The Slavic lands sit where winters are long and nights are deep. People who live there get used to looking up. The sky tells them when to sow and when to reap, when to travel and when to stay close to the stove. The constellations they traced were often tied to their own lives. They did not always see bears and lions in the patterns. They saw ploughs and wagons, the tools and vehicles that shaped their days. That bright curved line of stars in the north, that other cultures called a bear, became for them a cart, moving eternally across the sky, pulled by invisible oxen. The Milky Way could be a heavenly road of souls, or the spilt grain from the bag of a careless celestial farmer. In all of these, Dashbog and Mysiats and the Zorias played their roles, not as distant abstractions, but as members of a powerful extended family whose quarrels and affections had direct consequences for the frost line and the timing of spring floods. Even Perun and Veles found themselves woven into this bright tapestry. When thunderheads rolled in and swallowed the sun, it was said that Perun was advancing across the sky with his army, chasing Veles, who had once again crept up from the roots to steal something. The lightning would split clouds that had a moment earlier looked innocent and reveal for an instant the hidden architecture of the storm. The Zoria sisters could do little in those moments besides stand at their gates and watch. They did, however, make sure that when the storm broke and the sky cleared, the sun could find its road again and not be left wandering. When lightning struck a tree or a house and set it ablaze, villagers might say that Perun had aimed at Veles, hiding there, and had missed. When the smoke cleared and night fell, they would look up at the first appearing star and whisper a small greeting to Zoria Vechernaya, grateful that at least she was constant. There were nights when the sky over the Slavic lands seemed crowded with meanings. The full moon rode high, silvering the snow. The Milky Way stretched from horizon to horizon, a faint white bridge. The constellation of the wagon wheeled slowly toward the north, eternally just out of reach of the chained beast. The faint flicker of aurora gathered near the horizon, suggesting unseen battles among the gods of the upper air. In a clearing far below, humans gathered around a fire, telling these very stories, mapping their own fears and hopes onto the glittering canvas above. A girl might whisper a secret wish to the morning star, asking for a good husband. A mother might peek out at the evening star and murmur a prayer for her son's safe return from war. A shepherd might watch the changing moon to guess the weather for his flocks. Without needing to write it down, each of them understood that they lived under a sky that was not empty, but fully inhabited. In that way, Dazbog and Mysiats and the Zorias were more than pretty ornaments. They imposed a sense of order on things that could easily have felt random. They divided time into smaller pieces than the great sweeps of season that Jarilo and Murano would rule in their tragic dance. They gave names and faces to the daily certainty that the light would return, that night would come gently, that the dark at midnight was watched over by someone who did not sleep. They set a pattern of guardianship, of sisters who keep chains in good repair, of brothers who ride their appointed paths even when they would rather do something else. It is no coincidence that in many Slavic fairy tales, the heroes and heroines navigate their fates by following stars or by recognizing personifications of dawn and dusk who offer advice. The myths of the radiant sky trained generations to read the heavens as a kind of text written by gods who, while distant, were not uninterested. And so the world above the clouds became a second theatre layered over the first. On the lower stage, Perun and Veles thundered and plotted. Mokosh tended the soil and the work of women. Svarog hammered, and Dashbog scorched, and Strebog blew. On the higher stage, the sun traced his curve. The moon drifted. The constellations wheeled, and the star maidens kept their silent watch over the chained beast at the center. The two levels were not separate. They informed each other. A drought might be read as Veles hoarding water, but it was also a matter of Dashbog's chariot blazing in an unclouded sky day after day without relief. A flood was Perun driving the rain out of Nav, but also the work of Strybog sending clouds to pile and burst, and the sigh of Zoria Vechernaya, who had to watch the water climb the steps of human houses. In such a world, to fall asleep under the open air was to lie in the middle of a great complex machine of meaning. You were a small point between earth and sky, between soil and stars, with gods above you and gods below. Every glitter, every calm silver wash of moonlight, every sudden absence of light carried a story older than your grandparents. The Slavs named these lights because they knew that anything left unnamed feels colder. To call something Zoria is to admit that dawn is not just a time, but a presence. To call the moon Mieziats is to admit that his changing face has character. To call the sun Dashbog is to accept that the warmth that ripens grain comes from a being who can be praised or offended. It is in this layer of belief that the radiant gods of the sky take their place in the larger Slavic mythic frame, not as decoration, but as necessary pieces in the long game of balance that began when Rod first stood up in his little boat on the primordial sea. The sky knows its players now. The mountain knows who stands on its crown. The underworld knows who coils in its depths. Between these realms, a web of light stretches and tightens, held by the hands of bright maidens and stubborn gods. There is a moment in the Slavic year when winter holds the land so tightly that it seems no other season has ever existed, and yet somewhere far below the frozen rivers and the snow-packed fields, something stirs. The stories say that this stirring begins on the last night of the old year, a night the Slavs called the Great Night, when the year stands with one foot in death and one in rebirth. On that night, a child is born in the high halls of Perun, not in a soft bed, but on a stone floor washed by the light of distant lightning. This child is Jarilo, whose name carries the taste of spring in it, the promise of brightness and youth. He comes into the world while Morana, the frost goddess, still walks freely over the earth, covering rivers with ice and bending pines under the weight of snow. The two of them are children of the Storm Lord, in many tales, born as twin sparks on the very edge of the turning year, one bright with the energy of awakening, the other pale and cold with the power of sleep. It should have been a joyous birth for the house of Perun. The thunder god, stern as he is with others, is not immune to the strange softening that comes when he looks upon his own young. Jarilo in his arms is not yet the strider of fields or the laughing god of May. He is a small, squalling thing with a faint scent of new grass beneath the smell of godly smoke. Morana, his twin, is quieter. In the stories, she looks up at the rafters and beyond them, as if she can already see the long white stretches of winter that will one day be hers. Between them there is a thread that is not easily named, stronger than simple brother and sister, for they are more than children. They are forces waiting to take shape. If the story ended here, the year would be simple. Spring would follow winter in a tidy hand, off from one child of Perun to another. But of course, the story does not end here, because there is another presence watching from below, jealous of everything the sky god claims as his own. In the realm of Nav, the underworld, Velis has felt the birth of the twins as a vibration along the roots of the world tree and along the veins of ore under the mountains. He lies there among his hordes of cattle and treasure, in halls of dripping stone, and he thinks of balance. Perun has taken the heights. Perun calls the thunder his. Perun now has not only a herd of cloud cattle and a throne beneath the scarred oak, but children glowing with fresh power. Veles has his shadows, his rich soils, his deep waters, but he is not content. A god like Veles is never content with what he is given. He wants to reach into the places that others call theirs. He had once tried to overthrow Rod and been flung down for it, and the scar of that fall still throbs in his bones. Now he sees a different kind of opportunity. You cannot easily steal the throne from a god of storms. You can, however, steal his child. So, on that great night, while Perun sleeps for a few short hours with his war gear unbuckled, while even Svarog's forge glows low and quiet, and the sun rests truly in the underworld sea, Veles rises. He does not come up by the obvious paths. He pours himself into the shape of a mist and climbs through cracks in the stone, spreads himself through the veins of water that seep under the walls of Perun's hall, gathers himself again into the shape of a dark man with the eyes of a beast. There are guardians here, spirits who tend the fires, minor deities who watch the doors. They do not see him. Their watch is for foreign enemies, for open bolts from the underworld, not for an intruder who comes as a flaw in the mortar of the very world. He finds the cradle where the twins lie. The stories do not agree on whether Morana is there beside Jarilo, or whether she has already been taken away to be raised somewhere else, more fitting for a winter goddess. Some say Veles looks upon both infants and understands that he cannot take them both without bringing Perun's full wrath down on his head before he has even turned back toward Nav. Others say he has no interest in Morana at all, that the cold belongs naturally to the heights, and he cares more for what is green and growing. However he reasons, his hand closes on Jarilo alone. He lifts the child, and for a heartbeat the baby opens his eyes and looks into the face of the one who will be his foster father. There is no fear there. How could there be, when he has not yet learned what Perun and Veles even are? Then the underworld god wraps him in a cloak of shadow and vanishes, leaving the cradle empty, and the year changed in a way no one yet understands. Perun's anger when he discovers the loss is beyond thunder. The mountain trembles, trees shudder on distant plains, lightning falls inside his halls and scorches his own thresholds. Yet there is nothing to strike. Veles is already back in Nav, moving down and down through shafts of cold stone, carrying the stolen godling against his chest like a treasure. Perun could hurl bolt after bolt into the deep, but he knows from bitter experience that he cannot blast Veles completely out of existence. He can only scar him. He can only drive him deeper. The thunder god stands on his mountain and shakes the sky with his rage, vowing that if his son ever returns, it will be under his eye and no one else's. The echo of that vow will hang over every spring from then on. In the underworld, life for Jarilo is strangely gentle. Nav is not a place of endless torment, in the way later faiths would paint their own underworlds. It is a place of dampness and richness, of evergreen meadows and slow dark rivers, of cattle that graze on moss and lichen under stone arches, of fields that never burn under a summer sun, because the sun never reaches that far. Here Veles is undisputed master. He teaches the child to walk along the banks of those underground streams, to listen to the lowing of spectral herds, to understand the language of roots. Jarilo grows tall on the milk of underworld cows, his hair pale as shoots that have never seen open daylight. He learns to move silently, to navigate the half-twilight of a world lit by phosphorescent fungi and the strange glimmer of minerals. He is a son of Perun by blood, but his heart is shaped by Veles, earth and water. Time in Nav does not pass as it does in Yav. Years can curl in on themselves like fern fronds. A day on the surface can feel like an hour below. Still, every realm answers eventually to the same wheel. Above, in Yav, winters come and go. The first snows fall on the forests that Mokosh has coaxed up from the bare bones of stone. Rivers freeze and thaw. In the villages that will one day spread in these lands, people will mark this cycle with rituals, but for now, only the spirits and the gods note it. Below, in the evergreen pastures of Nav, Veles decides that the boy he stole has ripened. There comes a spring when Jarilo is no longer just a fosterling trailing after spectral cattle. He has become a lithe youth with strong hands and the restless eyes of someone who knows that somewhere above this ceiling of rock another world exists. He has heard the rumble of Perun's storms like distant drums. He has seen in his dreams a sky that is not made of stone. Desire rises in him, not yet shaped fully into words, but as sharp and undeniable as the first thaw. The myths say that on the day of the spring equinox, the boundaries between the realms thin, night and day balance, for a moment, like a scale before it tips toward light. In Slavic tradition, this is the time of Jarilo's return. Veles leads him to a place in Nav where a river of that shadowy realm pours up instead of down, bubbling toward a crack in the roof. He tells the youth that his path lies there. It is hard to tell in these stories whether Veles is reluctant to let him go or eager to see what mischief he will cause in the territory of Perun. The underworld god is not simple enough to feel only one thing. Perhaps he feels the odd ache a foster father feels when a child leaves, and at the same time the sly pleasure of sending a piece of his own realm into the lands above as a kind of living embassy. Jarilo steps into the rising water. For a moment, he is carried as if in a narrow green cradle, surrounded by bubbles that smell of wet earth and moss. Then he bursts upward. Snow is still lying in patches on the surface of the world, clinging in shady hollows and along the edges of fields that are not yet ploughed. The air is sharp and bright. The sun hangs higher than it did a month before, and the light has a new quality, not the cold glitter of winter, but a growing warmth. He stands there, dripping on the banks of a real river, blinking at the openness of the sky. This is his first spring in Yav, though his spirit remembers that the wheel has turned many times without him. Everywhere he walks, the snow begins to give way. Beneath his bare feet, the ground softens. In his footsteps, the first flowers push their heads up, not neat tame blossoms in garden rows, but wild things, snowdrops and crocuses, shy and fierce at once. His laughter is like the sound of ice breaking on river stones. He moves along the edges of forests, and the trees feel him pass. Buds swell on their branches in places where his hand has brushed the bark. Birds begin to call in ways they have not called since the autumn. Jarilo is not doing this deliberately. He is not yet a cultivated deity who plans the growth of fields. He is a young god whose very presence tilts the world toward life. Morana feels it. She has been ruling the surface in his absence, walking over lakes that freeze solid at her touch, laying her thin white hands on roofs so that frost grows in delicate patterns on the planks. She has been the undisputed queen of the long night, moving through forests where every twig is rimed with ice, listening to the creak of frozen trunks. In those months she is not a jealous lover or a tragic widow. She is simply herself, the necessary stillness that lets the earth rest. But now, as Jarilo strides out of Nav, something in her bones flares, a painful spark of recognition. The stories say that she does not yet remember him as the brother stolen from their shared cradle. She senses only a presence that is both foreign and familiar, like the scent of smoke on an old garment. She finds him in a clearing by a half-frozen stream, standing ankle-deep in meltwater and laughing as it swirls around him. Her appearance in this scene varies from tale to tale. In some, she is still in her winter form, tall and thin, wrapped in a cloak of hoarfrost, hair black as a raven on snow, eyes pale as ice. In others, she has already begun to change, her cheeks flushed with the first touch of warmth, her cloak loosened, the edges of her frost melting into beads of water. However she looks, Jarilo is struck. He has grown up among shades and stone. Here is a figure of sharp, clear beauty, the kind that can cut as well as delight. He bows, perhaps mockingly, perhaps in genuine awe. She regards him with cold curiosity. This is their first meeting in the world of Yav, and the entire future of the seasons hangs quietly on its tone. From that moment, spring is no longer just a matter of temperature. It becomes a courtship. Jarilo follows Marana across the land as she retreats step by step before the growing warmth. Where she lingers, frost holds. Where he comes close behind her, the frost cracks and drips away. They speak. The content of their conversation has been lost to time, but the results are written in ritual. Villages in Slavic lands would later celebrate this unfolding romance with processions. Young men carrying green branches and wearing wreaths of fresh leaves would walk through the streets as embodiments of Jarilo, stopping at houses to receive small gifts and to bless the year. Girls would tie ribbons on birch trees and sing songs that called the young god of spring to their fields and to their hearts, weaving tales of love that are half human and half divine. At the same time, they would also build the figure of Marana. She was not always honored as a bride. In many regions, she was made as a straw effigy, dressed in old woman's clothing, with a scarf over her head, and perhaps a necklace of broken pots around her neck. Children and adults together would carry this image of the winter goddess through the village, singing songs that mocked the cold and begged heat to return. In some places, they would then burn the effigy on a high hill so that everyone could see, letting the sparks rise into the spring dusk. In others, they would throw her into a river, watching as the current tore her apart and carried the pieces away. They did this not because they scorned Marana, but because they understood that she had to die again and again so that she could be reborn. The drowning of Marzana, as it later came to be called, is just one echo of the deeper myth in which Marana kills and is killed in turn. For in the mythic cycle, the romance between Jarilo and Marana does not end at flirtation. As spring strengthens and turns into early summer, they grow closer. Marana thaws. She becomes a maiden in truth, no longer the gaunt figure of frost, but a strong young woman with hair like dark water and skin warmed by the sun. Jarilo matures from a laughing youth into a god who can shoulder responsibility. He learns from Mokosh the ways of seed and soil, how to walk the fields without crushing the tender shoots. He learns from Svarog how to respect the tools that men will one day use to cut and bind grain. He stands taller. The buds he wakes become full leaves and blossoms. The world is green and singing. In this swelling fullness, the gods arrange their wedding. It takes place on the night the Slavs would later call Kupala Night, a midsummer festival of fire and water. On that evening, bonfires are lit on riverbanks and on hilltops. People leap over the flames to purify themselves and to test their courage. Young women float wreaths of flowers with candles on the rivers, watching to see how far they drift and where they snag, reading omens for their future husbands. Lovers slip away into the dark woods to search for the mythical fern flower, a blossom that blooms only at midnight and only for those whose hearts are true, and which promises great fortune to whoever finds it. All of these customs are thin, mortal copies of the greater marriage of Jarilo and Marana, which takes place under a sky thick with stars and with the approval of almost every power in Prav and Yav. Perrin attends this wedding with a mixture of pride and unease. He has his son back in his world now, walking openly under his sky and that is cause for joy. Yet the boy has been raised in the underworld. Vele's influence clings to him like the scent of dark earth. To see him take Morana as his bride, Morana, who is also Perun's daughter in many tales, is to see a joining not only of siblings, but of rival realms. Jarilo is the green hand of Nav reaching into the house of Perun. Morana is the cold breath of the heights that will one day move over the underworld. Rod perhaps sees farther than all of them. He understands that without such crossings, the world would become stale. The wheel requires friction. So the ceremony goes on. The songs at that divine wedding must have been grand. The sun god is high and lingering on the longest day of the year, bathing the gathering in light. The Zoria sisters watch from their gates. Strybog sends only soft winds that stir the garlands and the smoke from the offering fires, without tearing anything down. Morkosh stands beside Morana, touching her hair and her wrists, marking her as a woman now tied to the soil and to the fates of harvests. Veles watches from some shadowed distance, perhaps from the shade of a stand of trees, perhaps from the bank of a nearby river, in the shape of a stranger whose eyes glow faintly with reflected lightning. He does not interrupt. He does not need to. His claim on Jarilo is already woven into the boy god's bones. For a time after the marriage, the world seems perfectly balanced. The fields are thick with grain, fruit swells on branches, rivers run clear and strong. The people who will later give thanks in their small wooden churches and shrines to Christian saints are at this point still turning to their wooden idols and to the open sky, and they feel the presence of Jarilo in every green thing. They bless their fields with water that has been through fire. They dance in circles late into the night. They believe, with a particular intensity of people whose food depends on it, that the union of these gods means plenty for them. They are not wrong. While Jarilo and Morana love each other, the season is generous. But no youthful marriage stays in its first sweetness forever, not even one between gods. As the sun begins, almost imperceptibly, to sink earlier each day, as summer deepens, and the first faint yellow shows on the grasses at the field edges, cracks appear. Jarilo is, at his root, a god of restless growth. He is tied to the young phase of things. He has been raised by a trickster and taught that rules are a kind of pattern to be bent. Morana, for all her thaw and her new warmth, still carries winter in her soul. She understands endings and boundaries. In many versions of the myth, Jarilo betrays her. He is unfaithful. He goes to another woman, sometimes a human, sometimes another goddess of fertility. Perhaps he does not even think of it as betrayal. To a god of vegetation, life is always overflowing into the next furrow. Morana does not see it that way. She has given up the unchallenged solitude of winter for him. She has let her hard edges soften, has let her snowfields turn into meadows. When she learns of his infidelity, the old cold rises in her with a force made sharper by betrayal. Here the myth shifts from the tone of love song to the tone of tragedy. Harvest is approaching. The grain that Jarilo has nurtured stands tall and heavy, heads bowed with ripe seeds. It must be cut. The people will starve if it is not. On the divine plane, that means the god of the grain must die. Some say it is Perun who kills him, fulfilling his vow that no child of his can serve two masters. Some say it is the brothers of Morana, other thunderous deities, who strike him down in jealous rage, treating his adultery as an insult to their house. The more ancient and sharper versions say that it is Morana herself. She confronts Gerillo among the tall stalks, the scythes of the harvesters ringing around them like a deadly choir, and she strikes him as the last sheaves fall. His blood sinks into the earth. The stalks around him are trampled and broken. The god of spring lies cut down at the very moment of greatest abundance. This is not simply murder. It is sacrifice and transformation. In agricultural societies across the old world, there is an echo of this same pattern. The idea of a corn king or a spirit of the grain who must be slain so that the seed buried in the earth will quicken and rise again next year. In the Slavic version, Gerillo's body is not simply left in the field. Morana dismembers him, she scatters his limbs. In some tales she uses his bones and flesh to build a new dwelling, a house of winter that will rise as the fields empty. In others she plants the pieces in furrows, each fragment a seed that will push up as new green next spring. It is a grim image, but for people whose lives depend on the cycle of sowing and reaping it, makes a harsh kind of sense. Life eats life. Gods are not exempt. With Gerillo dead, Morana changes once more. The warmth she had taken on in their courtship and marriage drains away. She withdraws from the villages and the fields, going back to the deep forests and the bare hilltops. Her figure thins, her eyes grow distant. She becomes again the tall, pale goddess of frost, wrapped in rime, walking with quiet steps that leave no footprints on the first autumn snows. The world follows her. Leaves turn red and yellow and fall, leaving the trees bare. The wind grows sharper, the nights lengthen. Farmers bring in the last of their harvest and close up their barns. In their rituals, they echo her transformation. The same community that once dressed her effigy as a bride now burns or drowns her image to make way for the winter sovereign she has become, a figure to be feared and respected rather than courted. Winter, under Morana's full rule, is never an accident. It is her deliberate presence. She moves through sleeping villages, frost tracing patterns on window panes like her own white fingers. She glides over frozen rivers, listening to the deep creak of ice. She watches as the cattle breathe steam in their stables and as the people huddle around hearths, telling the stories that keep them tethered to the sense that seasons are not random, but the visible expression of divine moods. Under her reign, Gerillo is in Nav again, reduced to a memory, a potential. His spirit curls like a seed in the dark soil, waiting for the right night. Eventually, even winter must loosen its grip. The wheel turns back to the great night. Fires burn out. Old years die. In some tales, Morana cannot survive this transition in her full winter form. She grows too brittle. She cracks. She falls apart and is carried in pieces by rivers. Or she burns to ash in the hearths where people have warmed their hands. In others, she simply walks out into the white landscape and dissolves into the snow, leaving only her name hanging in the cold air. The point is the same. The goddess of winter dies or vanishes, just as Gerillo is born or reborn. The cycle resets. Perun's house once again has two infants. Veles once again feels the pulse of new life in the roots of the world and extends a shadowy hand. The story begins anew, with as many slight variations as there are years. For the Slavic peoples who lived inside this myth without necessarily naming it, Jarilo and Marana were not distant allegories. They were the explanation for the most basic and terrifying fact of their existence, that everything they relied on changed. The snow that seemed endless did melt. The green that seemed eternal did brown and die. Their entire economy, their whole world of effort, rested on the trust that after every winter there would be spring. To tell that story as a romance and a murder, as a wedding and a betrayal, is to give it emotional weight. It makes the cold mean something more than absence of warmth. It makes the harvest mean something more than piles of grain. It also gives them a way to participate. When they drown the straw Marana in the river, when they sing wild songs and jump over midsummer fires, they are not just having fun. They are assisting in the death and rebirth of gods. This is why in some regions the figure carried out of the village in spring is called not only Marzana but also Death. Children chant at her, calling her out, telling her to go away, promising that a new life will come in her place. Then they set her on fire or throw her into the water and watch her vanish. Immediately after that ritual, they often carry back into the village a green branch or a small evergreen tree decorated with ribbons and eggshells, a living symbol of Jarilo returning. The two motions, out and in, death and rebirth, mirror the motions of the gods themselves between Yav and Nav, between the house of Perun and the halls of Veles. In such ways, myth, ritual, and the stubborn practicality of farming life intertwine until they are indistinguishable. So the wheel of seasons in Slavic mythology is not a bland circle. It is a story of abduction, fosterage, courtship, marriage, adultery, murder, grief, and inevitable renewal. It is the story of a young god who belongs to both sky and underworld, and who must die regularly so that the world can eat, and of a goddess who must harden and soften her heart over and over, loving and killing the same figure across countless years. It is, in other words, deeply human in its emotional range, even as it moves on the scale of gods. If you were to walk far enough into the Slavic world, past the places where Perun strikes his oaks and Veles curls under hills, beyond the clearings where people plant and reap, you would come at last to a house that is not a house, standing beneath a tree that is not just a tree. This is how the old storytellers like to imagine it, because a place is easier to hold in the mind than an abstract idea. The tree is the world tree itself, its roots sunk into Nav, its crown brushing Prav, its trunk solid in Yav, where men and women live. Tucked against that trunk is a low cottage with smoke curling from its chimney, built of logs that never rot and roofed with turf that is always green. It looks, at first glance, like the home of a peasant widow who minds a small flock and keeps her loom by the window. It is not. It is the house of Mokosh. Inside, the air is warm and smells of wool and wet earth and bread. The floor is hard-packed clay, smooth from centuries of bare feet. Bundles of flax hang from the rafters. By the stove sits a great basket overflowing with skeins of yarn, some white as unfallen snow, some dark as river mud, some bright with colours that do not quite exist in the mortal world. At the centre of the room stands a woman, broad-shouldered and solid as the trunk of an oak, her dark hair braided and pinned up in a practical knot. Her hands are big and capable. There is nothing delicate about her, but there is a depth in her eyes that makes even gods speak to her with a certain care. This is Mokosh, whom the Slavs called Moist Mother Earth, patron of spinning and weaving, of woman's work and fortunes, and of the quiet, merciless arithmetic of fate. When the world was still young and Rod had only just called the first gods into being, Mokosh had risen out of damp soil with mud on her skirts and moss between her toes. She had walked the length of Yav, and wherever she rested her hand, the ground grew rich. Later, when people came, they turned to her in small daily things that mattered more than the grand quarrels of thunder and underworld. Women watched her as they turned flax into thread, as they kneaded dough and strained milk, as they bore children and laid out the dead. She watched them back. If Perun was the visible law that crashed down from above, Mokosh was the quiet law beneath the fingers, the sense that what is begun must be finished, and that every action is part of a pattern whether one sees it or not. On the far side of a cottage stands a large loom. It is an old thing, made of wood that might have once been part of the world tree itself. Warp threads hang from its upper beam in countless ranks, some taut and gleaming, some frayed and thin. They are not fibres of plant or animal. They are lines of time, stretched from birth to death for every creature that walks the earth. Mokosh does not weave alone. Seated around her at their own spinning stools are the Rozhenitsy, the mysterious birth goddesses whose work is to spin and measure and cut. There are usually 3 in the stories, because 3 is a number that satisfies the human need for beginning, middle, and end. 1 is young and bright-eyed, fingers nimble as she teases raw fibre from a basket and twists it onto her spindle. 1 is mature, calm and intent, guiding the spun thread onto the loom in careful passes. The last is older, hair grey and tightly bound, scissors gleaming at her belt. She rarely speaks, but when she does, the thread in her hand stops. The Slavic word for them comes from a root that means to give birth or to bring forth. The villagers imagined that whenever a child came wailing into the light, these unseen women would gather in the corner of the cottage, invisible to human eyes but quite real, and discuss the new arrival with Mokosh and with Rod, who as first ancestor and god of order sits in judgment even if he is not always pictured. They would decide how long the thread of this life should be, how many twists and knots should be in it, where it should cross others on the great cloth. Would this child be strong or frail, lucky in love, or doomed to lose those he cared for, blessed with a full granary, or haunted by hunger? The Rozhenitsy would spin and whisper and eventually nod. Once the first length of thread was fixed, even the gods hesitated to change it. People knew this in their bones, even if they never saw the cottage by the world tree. That is why they tried to win favour from these weavers. Long after the official worship of Rod and the old gods had faded under other names, villagers still set out offerings for the Rozhenitsy on quiet nights. A bowl of porridge on the table, a piece of bread and cheese, a cup of beer or mead. In some places, there was a special day each year when the housewife would sweep the floor clean, lay a white cloth on the bench, and invite the fate goddesses to feast while the family slept. Mothers would murmur little prayers when a baby first smiled, or when a child took his first step, not only thanking God in the new faith, but also, deep down, nodding to those three who had already measured his path. Mokosh presides over all this with a mixture of compassion and implacability. She is the only female deity among the highest Slavic gods that we know by name, which tells you something about how important her domain was. While men carved idols of Perun on hilltops and swore oaths by Veles at river stones, women whispered Mokosh's name over their spindles. She was linked with moisture, not only in the sense of literal water in soil, but in the sense of the dampness of life, blood, and milk, of the fluids that attend birth and love and death. It is no surprise that in folk belief, she is often tied to wells and springs and to Fridays, the day when women traditionally did not spin so as not to offend her. If someone disrespected that rhythm, if they spun or wove at the wrong time, tales say their thread would tangle, their cloth would tear, their fortunes would sour. In the mythic cottage, the Rozhanitsy spin not only for humans, but for gods as well. Perun's thread is thick and bright, with knots where Veles has pulled at it. Veles' thread is dark and sinuous, running through caverns of the cloth, looping around the roots of the world tree. Dashbog's thread glitters with tiny sparks. Strybog's curls and whips like a gust of wind. Hurilos is cut and tied and cut again, a series of shorter lengths knotted, end to end, as he dies and is reborn each year. Marana's thread is cold to the touch, stiff where it passes through the winter sections of the tapestry, and strangely soft where it doubles back on itself at every great night. Mokosh watches each of these with the same level grey gaze she turns on the threads of shepherds and weavers and kings. In the presence of fate, the difference between a god and a ploughman is not so great as the proud would like to believe. If you could see the cloth that grows on her loom, you would see the entire story of the Slavic cosmos woven into it. Perun and Veles clashing in patterns of white and black across the seasons. The radiant paths of sun and moon done in gold and silver. The wheel of Jarilo and Marana circling in an endless spiral. Whole villages, each human life, a tiny coloured knot, forming patterns of migration and war and alliance that only make sense when you step far back. Mokosh and the Rozhanitsy do not step back. They are inside the work, the way a heart is inside a body. They feel the tension in every thread they pull. It is tempting to imagine that someone might come to this house and argue, a hero who feels his fate is unjust, a grieving mother who demands her child's thread be tied back in, a proud god who wants his enemy's thread shortened. In the old tales, there are hints of such attempts. Men travel to remote crossroads at midnight to bargain, leaving offerings at stones and trees. Witches speak with house spirits and forest lords, hoping to steer luck, yet when it comes to Mokosh and the Rozhanitsy themselves, direct confrontation is rare. They are too old and too deep in the structure of things. You can try to appease them, to sweeten their mood with gifts and respect. You cannot easily make them undo what they have already woven without unraveling much more than you intended. In this way, the Slavs explain to themselves a fact that every people has to face, that even in a world crowded with gods and spirits, not everything can be bargained away. Perun might be pleased by a sacrifice and send rain instead of hail. Veles might be charmed into blessing your cows instead of laming them. The domovoi of the house might be soothed with a crust of bread and leave your pots unbroken. But behind all these small negotiations runs the larger strand of how your life is meant to go, spun by unseen hands long before you knew what to ask for. That strand is Mokosh's business. She is not cruel in the way some foreign fates are painted. She is no blind spinner who delights in cutting threads at random. She is more like a tired but thorough village woman who knows that someone has to keep track of who is born and who dies, who has eaten and who has gone hungry, who has worked and who has been idle. The Rozhanitsi chatter and laugh and sometimes sigh as they spin, but they are not sadists, they are craftsmen. Their pleasure is in seeing the pattern hold together. When a child in a Slavic village once asked his grandmother why some people seemed blessed from birth while others struggled all their days, the old woman might shrug and say that it was written that way. Written where? The child could ask. Not in a book. In the cloth on Mokosh's loom. The answer is both comforting and unsettling. It says that your life is part of something bigger and carefully made, and that also you cannot simply choose anything at all. You move along the threads you have been given, but you can still choose the way you carry their weight. In the great balance of the Slavic mythic world, Mokosh and the Rozhanitsi are as important as thunder and winter and sun. Without them, the story would be a chaos of gods and forces crashing against each other with no sense of timing. They are the quiet metronome behind everything. While storms rage and seasons turn above, in the cottage beneath the world tree the spinning wheels turn and the loom creaks softly, and the hands of the fate weavers never quite stop. There comes a time in every old story when the world it describes begins to look over its shoulder. The Slavic lands had grown crowded with meaning. Forests murmured with leshy, those tall, shaggy lords who could turn themselves into trees to confuse a traveller. Rivers ran thick with rusalki, the pale, drowned maidens who lured the unwary with soft songs. Fields had their own spirits, the polviks who watched over grain and sometimes led a drunk farmer wandering in circles until dawn. In every house, a domovoi crouched behind the stove, small and dark and furry, grumbling when the floor went unswept or the animals were not fed in the right order. Above all this, the great gods moved, Perun shaking the sky, Veles growling from below, Dazbog pouring light, Mokosh watching over the threads of destiny. It might have gone on forever like this, a world where every tree and hill and storm had its patron. But the world beyond the Slavic forests was changing, and change travels along trade routes and rivers more surely than any army. From the south and the west came stories of a different kind of god. Not one among many, not a thunderer with rivals, not a spirit of a particular oak or river, but a single lord who claimed the whole sky and everything under it. He came not in the form of a carved log or a polished stone idol, but in books full of writing that looked like crawling black ants. He had his own set of stories, stories of deserts and seas far away, of prophets and a crucified Saviour, of a garden lost at the beginning of time and a city of gold at the end. He rode north in the mouths of Greek priests who sailed up the rivers from the Black Sea, in the minds of merchants who had seen churches shining with icons in Constantinople, and in the ambitions of princes who understood that a faith with one God could be a tool as much as a comfort. The moment that stands in most chronicles like a spear in the ground is the baptism of the Rus, when Prince Vladimir in the city of Kiev ordered his people into the waters of the Dnieper and turned his face toward the new faith. In the annals, this looks straightforward, a matter of treaty and political choice. In the mythic reflection that lives alongside those parchments, it feels very different. The storytellers say that before Vladimir led his people into the river, he led Perun there first. On a hill overlooking the city stood a tall wooden idol of the thunder god, its face painted, its beard carved in deep strokes, its eyes set with bright stones. Altars, stained with the blood of sacrificed animals, stood before it. The prince had once sworn by this image. Now, under the eyes of newly arrived priests, he ordered it pulled down. The idol crashed to the earth, and armed men dragged it by ropes through the streets while onlookers jeered and crossed themselves or watched in silence or turned their faces away. When they reached the Dnieper, they heaved Perun's image into the current. The logs rolled, bobbed, caught for a moment on a sandbank, then were pulled free and carried away. A cry went up from some on the shore, not all of it insult. Some voices sounded like a farewell. The river took the old Thunder Lord and bore him down toward the sea, past sandbars and willowed banks, past fishing villages where people still muttered his name under their breath in storms. It is easy, reading this as history, to say that this was the end of Perun. In the mythic sense, it was only the beginning of his retreat. For gods do not die when their idols fall. They change shape. Perun did not vanish from the Slavic sky. The people still heard thunder. They still saw lightning split oaks. They still needed someone to address their fear, to when the fields shook under summer storms. The new faith had a figure very suitable for this. Elijah, the fiery prophet, rode a chariot into heaven in the old book, pulled by horses of flame. He belonged to the new God, but he carried in his story the taste of the old Thunder Lord. In time, the peasants of the Slavic lands looked up when storms rolled in and said, not Perun, but Elijah. They imagined him driving his chariot across the clouds, hurling fire at devils and dragons. The name had changed. The shape of the fear and awe had not. Veles also found new masks. As a god of cattle, wealth, and the underworld, he had always lurked near the edges of respectability. The new religion had no place for horned lords of hidden treasure except as enemies. Yet people still needed patrons for their herds and their coins, for their dangerous journeys across rivers and seas. In some regions, the kindly Saint Nicholas took on these duties. He became the protector of travelers and the guardian of wealth, the one to whom sailors prayed in storms, much as their grandfathers might once have muttered a plea to Veles on a riverbank. In other places, the shepherd St. Blasius, known as Vlach in the older tongue, took on the lordship of flocks. Old habits sank under new names. A peasant might stand before an icon of Nicholas, with its painted gold halo and picture in the back of his mind, not just a bishop from distant Myra, but also a shadow of a horned god lounging among roots and cattle in the dark. Mokosh, the moist earth mother, who watched over spinning and woman's fate, did not vanish either. She slipped quietly into the blue cloak of the Mother of God, and into the figure of Saint Paraskeva, the woman whose day was Friday, and to whom spinning and washing were linked. The Church might say that women should honour Mary and Paraskeva for their virtue and piety. The village women who lit candles before their icons sometimes saw something more in their faces, a memory of a broad-shouldered goddess whose hands smelled of wet soil and wool. On Fridays, many of them still refused to spin, not only out of church teaching, but out of the old dread that Mokosh would tangle their threads and twist their fortunes if they worked on her day. Other gods and spirits found similar half-remembered refuges. Jarilo and his bright spring rites melted into the feasts of St. George and St. John, when people drove livestock to pasture for the first time and lit fires on hills. Morana's effigy, burned or drowned at the end of winter, survived long after anyone in the village could have named her properly, under the cover of carnival customs and Lenten games. The Zoria Star Maidens were less easily baptized, but their watchful functions slipped into the idea of guardian angels who stand at the head of a bed and the foot of a bed, or into the way people greeted the first evening star with a small automatic wish. The Rozhanitsi, those quiet spinners of fate, shrank into the more respectable form of saints who attend births, and into the stubborn belief that no child is born without some invisible woman bending over its cradle. For a few centuries, the Slavic world lived in a state the scholars later called double faith. The village church stood on a hill with its graveyard and its bells and its painted saints. The priest chanted in Old Church Slavonic about the one God and his son and his mother. The people listened, crossed themselves, took the sacraments, and meant it. At the same time, when they walked home through the dark, they left a bit of bread on the stove for the domovoi, or made the sign of the cross in a way that also marked the old solar circle on their chest. They told their children to beware of the leshy in the forest and the vodianoi in the mill pond, to stay away from the riverbank at noon, when the Ruzalki combed their green hair and might drag a careless boy down. They lit candles at Easter, but they also hung dyed eggs on birch branches in spring, a gesture that carried with it Jarilos, old promise. Even Baba Yaga, that most famous of Slavic witches, can be seen as a fragment of the pre-Christian world that refused to disappear. She lives in a hut that walks on chicken legs, turning its door toward or away from those who seek her. She flies in a mortar, sweeping the air behind her with a broom, and she eats foolish travellers and disobedient children. Yet she also gives advice to heroes, provides magical items, and sets impossible tasks with the clear expectation that they can be fulfilled. Many scholars see in her the last warped echo of an old forest mother or death goddess, a being who stood at the threshold between life and death and decided who could pass. As the bright official gods of the pantheon were pushed away by the new faith, this ambiguous figure remained in tales told by the stove, a reminder that the wild has its own laws which no church bell can quite erase. The spirits of place endured, because they were intimately tied to specific barns, fields, and trees. A man who built a new house would invite the domovoi to come with him from the old one, tapping 3 times on the stove and whispering that there would be warm ashes and crumbs to share in the new hearth. A miller on a river would toss a bit of bread or a coin into the mill race for the Vodyanoi, hoping the water spirit would not drown him. In these gestures lived the old belief that the world was crowded with eyes and hands and hungers beyond the human. The new religion taught that there were angels and demons, but the peasants tended to fit those categories around entities they already knew. A leshy might be called a devil in a sermon, but the hunter in the woods still left him offerings in the old way. If you return now to the cottage beneath the world tree where Mokosh and the Rozhanetsi sit, you would see little outward change. The loom still groans under the burden of threads, now bearing the colours of princes who wear crosses and of monks who paint icons, as well as of warriors who once swore by Perun. In some sense, the shift from many gods to one is just another pattern in the cloth. The same storms roll over the fields, the same snow lies deep in winter, the same rivers flood in spring. The names that people shout when the lightning strikes their barn are different, but the raw emotion behind them is not. The gods of the old faith have stepped back from the hilltops into stories and customs and the deep soil of language, but they are not gone in the way a burnt log is gone. They are like embers under ash, ready to glow again whenever someone speaks their names with belief or even with simple curiosity. That is why, even now, if you dig into the folk tales and songs of the Slavic lands, you find the old ones peering back at you. A saint rides across the sky in a chariot of fire, and you hear a faint echo of Perun's hooves. A kindly bishop saves a drowning sailor, and there is Veles, rolling in laughter beneath the waves. A grandmother tells her grandchild not to whistle in the house, or the domovoi will be angered, and in that small superstition lives a whole cosmology of spirits sharing space with humans. Myth does not die when a new myth arrives. It moves house. It leaves the temple and takes up residence in the kitchen, the barn, the nursery, the hidden places where stories are told softly at night.